Friends, welcome to session 4 of Compassion Camp. This is a week or a session we're talking about journeying with others and what it means, how we live in community with one another. And really the core part of that is around compassion. So when you hear the word compassion, what comes to mind for you? What story speaks to you? A moment from your life where someone had compassion upon you. They came alongside you to support you and care for you. Is there a time like that comes to mind? There's a phrase that we sometimes use of saying, being there for, or always there for. So, is that, that's a big statement to say, I'm always there for you. I mean, does that mean you can call them at any, or they can call you at any point, at any day, for any reason? Yeah, maybe. When we say we're always there, is that kind of means that. Therefore, someone really, what I love about that phrase is that it's not just saying we're at a distance, we're right there with and for one another. I'm going to show you a video. It's from an organization that I follow called the Bible Project. They do these wonderful videos telling different stories from the Bible. And one of the best stories of people being there for one another is in the story of Ruth from the Hebrew Scriptures. And especially the first part of it, but the video goes through the whole of her story. But really the first part is the area we're going to focus on. So take a look.
The Book of Ruth. It's a brilliant work of theological art, and it invites us to reflect on the question of how God is involved in the day-to-day joys and hardships of our lives. There are three main characters in the book: Naomi, the widow, Ruth, the Moabite, and Boaz, the Israelite farmer. And their story is told in 4 chapters that are beautifully designed. Let's just dive in and see how this all unfolds. Chapter 1 opens with this line, "In the days when the judges ruled," and it reminds us of the very dark and difficult days from the book of Judges. And here we meet an Israelite family in Bethlehem, struggling to survive through a famine. And so in search of food, they move on to the land of Moab, Israel's ancient enemy. And there the father of the family dies, and the sons marry 2 Moabite women, Ruth and Orpah. And then the sons, they die too. And so they leave only Naomi and these new daughters-in-law. And so Naomi, she has no reason to stay anymore. And so she tells her new daughters-in-law that she's moving back home. And Naomi, she knows that the life of an unmarried foreign widow in Israel is going to be very hard. And so she compels the women to stay behind. Orpah agrees, but Ruth does not. She shows remarkable loyalty to Naomi, and she says, wherever you go, I'm going to go. Your people will become my people, and your God will become my God. And so the two of them return to Israel together. And the chapter concludes with Naomi changing her name to Mara, which means bitter in Hebrew, and she laments her tragic fate. Chapter 2 begins with Naomi and Ruth discussing where they're going to find food. And it just so happens to be the beginning of the barley harvest. And so Ruth goes out to look for food, and it just so happens that she ends up picking grain in the field of a man named Boaz, who just so happens to be Naomi's relative. We're told that Boaz is a man of noble character, and he notices Ruth. And so after finding out more about her story, he shows remarkable generosity to her. He makes these special provisions so that the immigrant Ruth can gather grain in his field. And in doing so, Boaz is actually obeying an explicit command of the Torah to show generosity to the immigrant and the poor. Boaz is so impressed by Ruth's loyalty to Naomi. He prays for her that God will reward her for her boldness. So Ruth comes home that day, and Naomi finds out that she met Boaz, and she is thrilled. She says Boaz is their family redeemer. Now, this family redeemer thing, this was a cultural practice in Israel where if a man in the family died and he left behind a wife or children or land, it was the family redeemer's responsibility to marry that widow, to take up the land and protect that family. So Naomi, she begins to hope that perhaps there might still be a future for her family. Chapter 3 begins with Naomi and Ruth making a plan to get Boaz to notice their situation. So Ruth is going to stop wearing clothes of a grieving widow, and she's going to show signs that she's available to be married. And so Ruth goes to meet Boaz on the farm that night. And as she approaches, Boaz wakes up and he's totally startled. And Ruth makes her intentions very clear. She asks if Boaz will redeem Naomi's family and marry her. Boaz is once again amazed by Ruth's loyalty to Naomi and her family, and he calls Ruth a woman of noble character. It's the same term used to describe the woman of Proverbs 31. So Boaz tells Ruth to wait until the next day, and he will redeem both Ruth and Naomi legally before the town elders. And so the chapter ends with Ruth returning to Naomi, and they marvel together at all of these recent events. In chapter 4, it all comes together. It turns out, at the last minute, Boaz discovers there is a family member who's closer to Naomi than he is, and he's actually eligible before him to redeem the family. But at the last second, this family member finds out that he's going to have to marry Ruth, the Moabite, and so he declines. But Boaz, remember, he knows Ruth's true character, and so he acquires the family property of Naomi, and he marries Ruth. And so just at the beginning, how Ruth was loyal to Naomi's family, so now Boaz is loyal to Naomi's family as well. The story concludes with a reversal of all of the tragedies from chapter 1. So the death of the husband and the sons is reversed as Ruth is married again and gives birth to a new son, granting joy to Naomi. And this symmetry between the opening and the closing, it's even more remarkable. So remember, the opening tragedy was followed by a great act of loyalty on the part of Ruth. And that is now matched by Boaz's act of loyalty that leads to the family's final restoration. And this symmetry, it highlights the design of the internal chapters as well. So each of the chapters begins with Naomi and Ruth making a plan for their future, and that's followed by a providential meeting between Ruth and Boaz, and each chapter concludes with Naomi and Ruth rejoicing at what's taken place. This story is beautifully designed, and that design actually connects with a really interesting feature of the story, and that's how little God is mentioned. Right? The characters talk about God a few times, but the narrator actually never once mentions God doing anything directly in the story, and that's its brilliance. Because God's providence is at work behind every scene of this story, weaving together the circumstances and choices of all these characters. So Naomi, her tragedy leads her to think that God is punishing her, but actually the whole story is about God's mission to restore her and her family. And he's doing so through Ruth, through her boldness and loyalty, which brings healing to Naomi's life, but not without Boaz, who's a no-nonsense farmer who's full of generosity and loyalty. And so God uses his integrity combined with Ruth's boldness to save Naomi and her family. And so this story brilliantly explores the interplay of God's purposes and will with human decision and will. God weaves together the faithful obedience of his people to bring about his redemptive purposes in the world. And that leads to the real end of the story. The book of Ruth concludes with a genealogy, showing how Boaz and Ruth's son, Oved, was the grandfather of King David, from whom came the lineage of the Messiah. And so all of a sudden, these seemingly mundane, ordinary events in this story are woven into God's grand story of redemption for the whole world. And so the book of Ruth invites us to consider how God might be at work in the very ordinary, mundane details of our lives as well. And that's what the book of Ruth is all about.
Part of compassion, part of being there for one another is to be present with one another. I mean, we can physically be with one another, but not be present with one another. I saw this last night, actually. Two of my three kids and I were down in the basement, and I noticed at one point, all three of us were on our phones, responding to text messages or doing something. Now, we weren't doing, we were just waiting for the others to come downstairs for us to watch a show together. But I just kind of found it funny that there we were, three of us, physically in the same space, but not really present with one another. I want to read you a story that was written by a child. And so this is kind of a little bit of a test here, a little bit of an experiment. So I'm going to read the story, and I want you to really try to listen and listen for the details. Okay? So here we go. I had a long day today. I was eating breakfast this morning at the breakfast table when my dad came in and said that we'd be leaving in 15 minutes to run some errands. I did not want to go. I wanted to sit at the table, finish my cereal, and play with my pet lizard, Vanessa. I felt frustrated. But I got into the car with my dad and we made our first stop at the grocery store to pick up some toilet paper, another box of my favorite cereal, and some coffee for dad. I asked for an apple and my dad said yes. Then we put our groceries in the car and we headed to the post office. Sometimes the post office is fun because I get to pick out the stamps. But today there was a long line and I didn't want to be there. My dad said it was very important. He had 2 boxes and an envelope while we waited in line. I felt compassion for him, so I offered to hold something. He gave me the smaller box and said thank you. Then we had to go to the dentist. My dad needed a cleaning, and so I had to sit next to him and wait. I read a magazine about lizards, and I ate my apple. And the dentist said that apples are good for my health. Finally, my dad said, "Thanks for being with me today. I have a question. Where would you like to go?" I was excited. I knew where I wanted to go. There's a park by my house that has an awesome climbing tree. My dad took me to the park so I could climb the tree and play for a while, and he even climbed up with me. It was a long day, but I'm glad we spent it together. The end. Take a moment right now and either draw or write down as many details about that story as you can. I'm not going to tell you what details, just how many can you think of. So pause the video at this point, do that, and then come on back. Okay, so how much of the story did you remember? What was the most interesting part for you? What stood out the most for you? What was most central for you about that? Now, I don't have an answer key that has the right answers to that. I'm just, how present were you for that story? Did you pick up on all the different feelings that were shared? Did you pick up on the places they went? Did you pick up on names? What did you imagine in your mind and in your heart as you heard this? Yeah, being present for one another. Jesus was that. I mean, Jesus obviously was in a time where, they didn't have iPhones and they didn't have these other things to distract them in the same way. Of course, my iPad just says, I'm not sure I understand. Well, yeah, sometimes neither do I. But that's another story. But one of the things I love about the Jesus stories is the way that he walks with, he journeys with, he sits with, he is present with each person. And that's an example for all of us to follow. So, a physical activity for you, okay? If you're up for it, maybe on a day that isn't quite as hot as it's been recently, or maybe do it early in the morning or late at night or something like that. Go out and just walk around your neighborhood some. Okay, it might be a long walk, a couple miles. It may be just a couple houses or a few blocks. Who knows? Okay, whatever you're comfortable with. Go out, take a walk, but be intentional about what you see in your neighborhood. Who's outside? What are they doing? What do you hear? What sense do you get of your neighbors as you walk around? What does it stir in you as you see others' houses or see people in their yards? What do you know of your neighbors? What don't you know? How can you be present in your neighborhood, in the place where God has put you, and have compassion for one another? Let's pray. Loving Spirit, you are active and alive, always moving and stirring within and around us. Be an encouraging wind at our backs, giving us open minds and soft hearts to follow where you lead. Make us flexible and present in each moment, that we might embrace compassion by letting go of what we expected. Amen. All right, so take the next couple weeks and work on what it means to be present with the people closest to you in your life, to be present in your neighborhood, and to be present for God. Grace and peace be with you.